stand where it's convenient for you. Okay? Sorry, Doctor.
Bianca Pomfret was the...
This person will die.
The Mask of Trust. In the quiet suburbs of Greater Manchester, a nightmare unfolded behind the veneer of respectability. Harold Frederick Shipman, a family doctor, a neighbor, a trusted pillar of the community, was in reality Britain's most prolific serial killer. Over 2 decades, he murdered at least 215 of his patients, almost all elderly women, under the cold calculus of a man who believed he could outwit death itself. His crimes were not acts of passion or desperation, but a chilling orchestration of control, power, and sadistic ritual. To understand Shipman is to confront a paradox. How could a healer sworn to do no harm become a monster who weaponized medicine? This is not just the story of a killer, but of a system that failed to see him, a profession that protected him, and a legacy that forced medicine to reckon with its darkest flaws. Shipman's victims were grandmothers, widows, and retirees. Women who welcomed him into their homes, who trusted his stethoscope and soothing voice. Their deaths were recorded as natural causes, their files neatly falsified, their families left to grieve without suspicion. It was a perfect crime, repeated hundreds of times until a single forged will and the persistence of a fellow doctor began to unravel his web. This documentary traces Shipman's life, his psychology, the catastrophic failures that enabled him, and the haunting question that lingers: could this happen again? The Doctor as Predator. Harold Shipman's crimes were a masterclass in manipulation, exploiting gaps in medical and legal systems with clinical precision. His weapon of choice was diamorphine, a pharmaceutical-grade heroin used for pain relief. Administered in lethal doses during routine home visits, it induced respiratory failure, mimicking natural death. Victims showed no signs of struggle. They simply slipped away, often in the presence of a man they viewed as a protector. Shipman's methods were methodical. He targeted vulnerable elderly women, many living alone, whose deaths were unlikely to raise alarms. He falsified medical records, inventing ailments like hypertension or old age to justify their sudden demise. In one egregious case, he even diagnosed a victim with cerebral metastases, brain cancer, despite her having no such condition. Autopsies were rare, and cremation forms, which he alone authorized, erased evidence forever. Criminologists classify Shipman as a medical predator, distinct from chaotic serial killers. He didn't stalk streets or hide in shadows. He operated in broad daylight, leveraging his authority to evade scrutiny. Unlike healthcare killers like Beverly Allett or Charles Cullen, who acted within hospitals, Shipman worked alone, eliminating witnesses by design. His crimes required no accomplices, no forensic awareness, just the arrogance of a man who believed his status rendered him untouchable. The pattern mirrored historical cases like Dr. Marcel Petiot, the French physician who murdered 60 Jews during World War II under the guise of medical treatment. But Shipman's scale dwarfed them all. He wasn't driven by ideology or profit, but by a perverse addiction to playing God. The system played into his hands. In the 1990s, Britain, GPs operated with minimal oversight. Death certificates required no second opinion if the deceased had seen a doctor within 14 days. Cremation forms, which Shipman frequently used, demanded only a rubber stamp from another physician, often a colleague who trusted his word. This lack of safeguards turned medicine into a murder weapon, and Shipman wielded it with impunity. The making of a monster. To dissect Shipman's psyche is to navigate a labyrinth of trauma, narcissism, and unresolved grief. Born in 1946 to working-class parents in Nottingham, Shipman's childhood was marked by his mother's prolonged battle with lung cancer, Vera Shipman, a domineering figure, relied on morphine to manage her pain, and the teenage Harold became her primary caregiver. Her death in 1963, when he was 17, left him devastated.
When he was 17, however, he came home one day and just saw her sitting there dead in her chair. And so that was very traumatic for him because he felt like he was never really able to attain that approval from her, and he no longer had the chance to do it since she had passed away.
Psychiatrists speculate this trauma planted the seeds of his pathology, a fixation on death, a need to control it, and a warped reenactment of his mother's suffering. In killing elderly women, he may have sought to reconcile his powerlessness over Vera's death, this time dictating the terms. Shipman's personality defies easy categorization. He lacked the impulsivity of a psychopath or the grandiosity of a classic narcissist. Instead, he exhibited what psychologists term hybristophilia, a sexual or emotional attraction to committing crimes, though in his case the thrill lay in the act itself, not the aftermath. He showed no remorse, even when confronted with overwhelming evidence. During his trial, he scribbled notes mocking prosecutors, and in prison he boasted to guards about his intelligence. Yet to outsiders, he was charming and devoted, a loving husband to his wife, Primrose, a doting father to their 4 children, and a respected figure at the local rugby club.
I was a friend of Fred. We were in the same year as one another. We played rugby together. He was a very, very able sportsman.
This duality, the Jekyll and Hyde split, allowed him to compartmentalize his atrocities. Forensic psychiatrist Dr. Richard Badger, who analyzed Shipman posthumously, described him as a controlled sadist. Unlike Ted Bundy or John Wayne Gacy, who derived pleasure from physical violence, Shipman's gratification was intellectual. He reveled in the deception, the meticulous planning, and the belief that he'd engineered the perfect crime. His victims were not people but pawns in a game only he understood. This detachment made him uniquely dangerous, a killer who saw murder as a clinical exercise, not a moral transgression. The man behind the myth. Harold Shipman's public persona was a carefully constructed facade. To his neighbors in Hyde, Greater Manchester, he was Fred, a genial GP who made house calls, donated to charity, and organized neighborhood watch programs. Biographer Carol Ann Davis, author of The GP from Hell, notes that Shipman cultivated this image deliberately. He wanted to be seen as a pillar of the community, she writes. The more respected he was, the easier it became to evade suspicion. Even his victims' families described him as kind and attentive in the weeks before their deaths. One daughter recalled him holding her mother's hand, assuring her, "I'll make sure she doesn't suffer." But behind closed doors, Shipman was cold and controlling. Former colleagues noted his arrogance. He dismissed younger doctors as incompetent and refused to collaborate on patient care. His home life was equally rigid. Primrose, his wife of 32 years, later admitted she never questioned his late-night visits or erratic behavior. When police raided their home in 1998, they found £12,000 in cash hidden under floorboards, a fraction of the £386,000 he'd inherited from victim Kathleen Grundy. Yet Primrose insisted until her death in 2021 that Harold was innocent, a testament to the psychological grip he maintained over those closest to him. Shipman's diaries, examined after his suicide, reveal a man obsessed with legacy. He wrote extensively about his medical achievements, but never mentioned his crimes. In one entry, he lamented the ingratitude of patients who criticized his care. It was the final irony, a man who spent his life crafting a heroic self-image, only to be remembered as the embodiment of betrayal. The unraveling. The cracks in Shipman's empire began with a single death and a daughter's intuition. In June 1998, 81-year-old Kathleen Grundy, a former mayoress of Hyde, collapsed suddenly after a routine visit from Shipman. Her daughter, Angela Woodruff, a solicitor, grew suspicious when Shipman bypassed standard protocols, rushing to label the death natural causes. But the true alarm sounded when Grundy's will surfaced. Drafted on Shipman's computer and signed just weeks before her death, it disinherited Angela and left £386,000 to Shipman. The document was riddled with errors, including Grundy's misspelled name. Angela knew her mother would never have drafted such a sloppy will, and she certainly wouldn't have left her fortune to a GP.
Sadly, nothing that's happened here, nor can happen in the future, can bring back my mum and all the other victims. We hope we can now have the space and the time to remember my mum as she was, a happy, active, caring, energetic, loving person whom we miss so much.
Detective Inspector Stan Egerton, leading the investigation, faced an uphill battle.
That I'd be dealing with not only one murder investigation, but a number of murder investigations.
Shipman had evaded scrutiny for years, thanks in part to a 1998 probe by Dr. Linda Reynolds, a local GP who'd noticed his patient mortality rate was triple the national average. But without physical evidence, the case was dismissed. Now, with Grundy's forged will, Egerton secured an exhumation order. Toxicology tests revealed lethal levels of diamorphine, a drug Grundy had never been prescribed. Shipman was arrested on September 7, 1998, but even then, he remained defiant. "I've done nothing wrong," he told officers. "This is a witch hunt." The investigation expanded rapidly. Police exhumed 12 more bodies, all Shipman patients, and found morphine in each. Witnesses came forward. A taxi driver who'd seen Shipman carrying a briefcase to victims' homes, a retired nurse who noticed vials of diamorphine missing from his office. Most damningly, Shipman's own records betrayed him. He'd backdated entries, invented symptoms, and even prescribed morphine to patients after their deaths. By January 2000, the Crown Prosecution Service had built a case around 15 murders, a fraction of his crimes, but enough to ensure a life sentence. A profession betrayed. Shipman's crimes exposed a healthcare system paralyzed by trust. GPs in the UK operated as independent contractors, subject to minimal oversight. Death certificates required no autopsy if the deceased had seen a doctor recently. And cremation forms, often signed by Shipman's friends, were treated as formalities. Dame Janet Smith, who led the public inquiry into Shipman, concluded that the medical profession had turned a blind eye to his actions. Colleagues dismissed Dr. Linda Reynolds' concerns as paranoia, while the General Medical Council GMC took no action despite multiple complaints. Even Shipman's 1976 conviction for forging prescriptions, for which he was fined £600, failed to trigger deeper scrutiny. He was, in Dame Janet's words, a man protected by his own reputation.
Pointless. The Secretary of State accepted that and put the brakes on the existing proposal. There followed a review by the Chief Medical Officer, which endorsed and very usefully built on my general ideas.
The fallout was seismic. The 2005 Shipman inquiry led to 92 reforms, including mandatory coroner investigations for sudden deaths and stricter controls on controlled drugs.
That's Elizabeth Pierce. The three ladies there, it's the elderly lady dressed in black. For the benefit of the tape, Dr. Shipman's eyes are closed and they did not look at.
GPs lost the authority to certify cremations alone, and the role of the GMC was overhauled to prioritize patient safety over professional solidarity. Yet for victims' families, these changes came too late. Many blamed not just Shipman, but a culture of deference that allowed him to flourish. As one relative lamented, "We trusted the system, and the system trusted him. That's how he won." The illusion of justice. Shipman's trial began in October 1999 at Preston Crown Court. Presiding over 15 murder charges, prosecutors painted him as a cold, calculating, ruthless killer. The defense argued the deaths were coincidental, a claim demolished by forensic evidence. Survivors like June Broadhurst testified about near-fatal encounters. One woman recalled Shipman injecting her with an unknown substance before she lost consciousness. The most damning testimony came from Angela Woodruff, who detailed the forged will and her mother's vibrant health before Shipman's visit. On January 31st, 2000, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts. Justice Thane Forbes sentenced Shipman to 15 life terms, condemning his wicked, wicked crimes. But the trial was merely a prologue. The Shipman Inquiry, launched in 2001, identified 215 victims, with 45 more highly suspicious cases. For families, the scale was incomprehensible. "We thought 15 was horrific," said one daughter. Then it became 215. How could one man do that and sleep at night? Shipman never confessed. He hanged himself in Wakefield Prison on January 13, 2004, the eve of his 58th birthday. A final act of control. In a spiteful suicide note, he accused his wife of infidelity and denied all crimes. For many, his death denied closure. "He robbed us of the truth," said Kathleen Grundy's granddaughter. "Now we'll never know why." Shadows and legacy. Harold Shipman's legacy is a scar on medicine. His crimes shattered the sacred trust between doctors and patients, replacing compassion with suspicion. Yet from this darkness emerged reforms that saved countless lives: tighter drug regulations, transparent death certification, and a culture that prioritizes vigilance over blind faith. Memorials in Hyde now honor his victims, their names etched in stone to defy oblivion. But questions linger. Could another Shipman exist today? Experts argue that systemic safeguards make it unlikely, but not impossible. As criminologist Professor David Wilson warns, evil thrives where good people do nothing. Shipman's story is a cautionary tale reminding us that monsters don't hide under beds. They wear white coats, carry stethoscopes, and smile as they close the door behind them. In the end, Shipman's victims were more than statistics. They were mothers, friends, and storytellers, women whose lives were stolen but whose memories endure. Their legacy is a world where medicine must first do no harm, but also a world that never forgets the cost of looking away.